Every city's got a man nobody wants to talk about at dinner. But in Miami, that man's name was Alejandro Voss. He was 37 years old, 6'2", with a thin scar running down his left jaw that he never bothered explaining, and a pair of gray-blue eyes that made grown men look at their shoes. He owned 2 casinos, a 72-foot yacht docked at Island Gardens, a chain of waterfront restaurants that U.S. Marshals couldn't shut down no matter how many warrants they filed, and a $12 million mansion on Star Island where he kept 9 American alligators in a concrete-walled pond right in the middle of his front courtyard. People in the underworld called him El Lagarto, the lizard. They said he fed informants to those gators alive and watched from his balcony while sipping Macallan 18. They said a man once owed him $400,000, showed up 2 weeks late with the cash, and left Star Island without his left hand. Most of that wasn't true. But Alejandro never corrected anyone, because fear is the cheapest fence a man can build, and he needed every inch of it. Here's what nobody in Miami knew. Beneath that alligator pond, hidden under 6 feet of murky water and a steel hatch that only opened with his fingerprint, sat a tunnel, and at the end of that tunnel was a bunker. Clean walls, small beds, a medical station, a counseling room, and inside that bunker, on any given night, anywhere between 8 and 20 women and children were sleeping safely for the first time in months, sometimes years, because Alejandro Voss had been pulling them out of shipping containers and basement rooms for 9 straight years. Not for money, not for power, for a promise he'd made to a woman who died when he was 17, a woman whose name he never spoke out loud, a woman whose last letter still sat locked in his nightstand, folded the same way she'd folded it 20 years ago. He built an empire ugly enough that no one would ever look beneath the surface. He let the rumors grow. He let them call him a monster, because monsters don't get searched. Until one night, in March of 2024, his people pulled a 27-year-old woman out of a container at Port Miami, and everything changed. Her name was Maeve Calloway. She had auburn hair matted to her skull, green eyes that wouldn't look down no matter how many months she'd spent in the dark, and she was carrying something inside her head, far more dangerous than any weapon Alejandro had ever touched. A list of names that reached from the Mexican cartel all the way up to the 7th floor of the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. Every single one of them wanted her dead. And Alejandro Voss, the man they called the Lizard, was the only thing standing between that woman and a shallow grave. What happens when the most dangerous man in Miami risks his entire empire to protect someone the whole country wants silenced? And what happens when the monster everyone fears turns out to be the only one who ever bothered to look? If this sounds like a story worth hearing, hit that like button right now, share this with someone who loves a good thriller, and subscribe if you haven't, because this one's just getting started. Now, let's go back to the night that container arrived at Port Miami, because what Alejandro found inside wasn't just a woman. It was the match that lit every fuse he'd spent 9 years trying to keep from burning. Tommy Shaw was sitting in his apartment in Brickell at 2 o'clock in the morning when his phone vibrated. He wasn't asleep. He rarely slept before 3 o'clock, because the nights in Fallujah still hadn't fully let go of him, and his left hand still trembled slightly whenever the weather shifted. The call came from a number that wasn't saved, but Tommy knew who was calling. It was Rigo, a dock worker at Port Miami, whom Alejandro had paid for 6 years to do one single thing: call whenever a strange container arrived at the port and no one came to claim it. Pier 7, Rigo said. 40-foot container. Serial number starts with MSKU. No pickup paperwork. The driver left 15 minutes ago. Tommy ended the call, put on his jacket, tucked the Glock 17 into the back of his waistband, and drove to the port in 18 minutes. He didn't call Alejandro. Not yet. He needed to see it with his own eyes first, because not every container was the same. Some held smuggled goods, some held weapons, and some, when opened, carried a smell that told a man what was behind the steel before his eyes had time to see it. Pier 7 was silent. Halogen lights shone down over the container yard, carving sharp-edged shadows across the wet concrete. Rigo stood about 30 feet from the container, his face pale, a dead cigarette still pinched between his fingers though he hadn't thrown it away. He pointed toward the steel doors. Tommy stepped forward, cut the lock with bolt cutters, and pulled the latch bar aside. The door opened. The smell struck him first. Sweat, urine, dried blood, and something harsher. Something Tommy had only smelled once in his life. inside a house on the outskirts of Baghdad in 2005. It was the smell of human beings trapped too long in a space too small, with no water. Inside was pitch black. Tommy switched on his flashlight and swept the beam in. 23 women sat on the steel floor, crowded between empty plastic water jugs and plastic bags filled with moldy bread. No one said anything. No one cried. No one screamed or ran toward the door. They just sat there, eyes lowered, shoulders drawn in, like living creatures who had learned that not every open door brought anything good. Tommy moved the flashlight slowly from left to right. He counted. 10, 15, 20, 23. Most were young, somewhere between 18 and 30 years old. One had bruises on her face. One had a hand wrapped in cloth torn from a shirt. One dark-haired girl with a high pregnant belly sat leaning against the corner of the container, eyes closed, breathing shallowly. And then Tommy saw her, the woman sitting closest to the door, less than 5 feet from him. She wasn't looking down. She was looking straight at him. Not with pleading, not with fear. She looked at him the way someone who had walked through hell looks at a man standing in the doorway, calm and exhausted at the same time, as if she were saying, "I'm still here," without needing to open her mouth. Reddish-brown hair clung to her scalp. Her green eyes were swollen but alert. She was so thin her collarbones stood out beneath her dirty skin, and on the index finger of her left hand there was a ring. Tommy looked closer. A college ring. The engraving was too faint in the flashlight beam, but he recognized the shape. Georgetown. Tommy stepped out of the container and turned his back so the 23 women wouldn't see his face when he made the call. He dialed Alejandro. 2 rings. "You need to come here." Alejandro didn't ask where, didn't ask what happened. He only said, 15 minutes, and hung up. He arrived in 12 minutes. The black Range Rover stopped 50 feet from the container, headlights off, engine running. Alejandro got out, dressed in a black suit, no visible weapon on him, and walked straight to the container door, without looking at Rigo, without looking at Tommy. He looked inside. He stood there for nearly a minute without saying anything. Tommy had seen Alejandro stand in front of many containers like this over the past 9 years, and every time, he stood just that still, as if he were counting, as if he were memorizing every face, as if he were keeping a promise to someone whose name Tommy had never dared to ask. Then Alejandro turned to Tommy, his voice low. "The girl near the door. Georgetown ring. Who is she?" Tommy shook his head. "Don't know yet, but if she belongs to someone important, this won't stay quiet." Alejandro looked back into the container. The girl was still looking straight at him. She didn't lower her eyes, didn't blink. He gave the order, short and clean. "Take her to the car. The other 22 stay where they are. Leave the container doors open. Call the anonymous Border Patrol line. They'll be found within an hour." But the girl with the Georgetown ring wouldn't be. Tommy led her out of the container. She stood up slowly, her legs trembling, but she refused to hold on to anyone. She stepped into the halogen light and blinked because it was too bright after so many days in darkness. But she didn't cover her face. She looked at Alejandro standing beside the car, looked at the portyard, looked at the Miami sky near 3 o'clock in the morning, a black horizon with dots of yellow light far away. She got into the car without asking where they were going. Tommy drove. Alejandro sat in the passenger seat. She sat in the back. No one said a word for the entire 23 minutes from Port Miami to Star Island. She didn't cry. She didn't sleep. She didn't speak a single word. She only sat there, both hands resting on her lap, the Georgetown ring glinting every time the car passed beneath a streetlight, and stared out the window as if she were trying to memorize every road in case she needed to run. The car stopped in front of the Star Island mansion gate at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. Tommy cut the engine and turned to look at Alejandro. Alejandro nodded once, then opened the door and stepped out. He didn't glance back at the girl in the back seat. He only walked straight through the iron gate, across the white stone path leading into the front yard, and stopped at the edge of the alligator pond. He looked down at the black water. Security lights shone down from the mansion roof, laying pale yellow streaks across the surface, just enough to reveal the shadow of something large drifting slowly underneath. Madre, the largest alligator, more than 3 meters long, its dark gray skin speckled with moss, was sliding across the water without making a single ripple. Alejandro stood there for a few seconds, then turned back toward the car, where Tommy was leading the girl out. She stood on the path and looked at the pond, looked at Madre's shadow drifting past less than 4 meters from her feet. She didn't step back. She didn't ask what it was. She only stood there, barefoot on the cold stone, and watched the animal swim by with the same expression she had worn since stepping out of the container. So calm it was frightening, as if she had no room left inside herself to hold any more fear. Alejandro walked ahead. Tommy followed behind her. They circled the edge of the pond, along the low concrete wall that bordered it, toward a hidden western corner where anyone looking in from the gate would see only trees and darkness. Alejandro stopped, placed his finger on a sensor panel mounted at waist level, hidden behind a layer of fake stone. A short beep sounded. The ground beneath their feet trembled slightly. Then a section of the concrete floor slid aside, revealing stairs leading down beneath the surface of the pond. Not an elevator, not a trapdoor from a movie, just a narrow passage, wide enough for one person, with damp, concrete steps descending about 3 meters underground. Alejandro went down first. Maeve looked at the stairs, looked at the pond water a few meters away where Madre had just swum past, then followed without saying anything. Tommy came last, and the slab slid shut above their heads. A concrete corridor. White fluorescent lights ran along the ceiling, bright and clean in a way that stood in complete contrast to everything above. White painted walls, a dry floor, cool air because the ventilation system ran constantly, a faint smell of antiseptic mixed with baby soap. Maeve slowed her steps, not because she was afraid, but because she was trying to process what her eyes were seeing. On the left side of the corridor, through an open doorway, there was a small common room. Inside, a young woman, around 20 years old, with brown skin and black hair tied high, sat in a gray fabric armchair, holding a child of about 2 who was asleep against her chest. The child wore pale yellow pajamas. The woman looked up at Maeve through the doorway, not alarmed, not curious, only looking the way someone looks when she has grown used to seeing new faces appear at midnight, then lowered her head, kissed the child's hair, and returned to where she had been. Maeve looked at the sleeping child. She stopped in front of the doorway for nearly 3 seconds. Then she kept walking. At the end of the corridor, another woman was waiting. She was tall, around 35 years old, with shoulder-length brown hair, wearing a white shirt and black trousers as if she were still on duty even though it was nearly 4 o'clock in the morning. Her face was calm but not cold. Her brown eyes watched Maeve the way a doctor looks at a new patient, without judgment, only assessment. "I'm Vivienne Ashford," she said, her voice low and even. "You're safe here." She didn't say anything else. She didn't ask Maeve's name. Didn't ask where she came from. Didn't ask what had happened. She only turned, walked down the corridor, and Maeve understood that she was supposed to follow. Alejandro had disappeared at some point without her noticing. Tommy had too. There was only Vivienne now, and the sound of 2 women's footsteps on the concrete floor. Vivienne opened a door on the right side of the corridor. A small room, about 12 square meters. A single bed with white sheets. A small table. A plastic chair. A clean set of clothes folded neatly on the pillow. A bottle of water placed on the table. The room had no window, but there was a small ventilation fan on the ceiling, turning slowly and steadily. Maeve stepped into the middle of the room and stopped. She looked at the bed, looked at the white sheet without a single wrinkle, looked at the pillow. She stood there long enough for Vivienne to understand that she wasn't choosing. She was trying to believe. 14 months earlier, Maeve Calloway had slept on a bed with white sheets in her apartment in Georgetown. 14 months later, she stood in an underground room beneath the alligator pond of a mafia boss and stared at a bedsheet that looked exactly the same, not knowing what she was supposed to feel. "Is this another prison?" she said, her voice hoarse but not trembling. "Or the old one?" Vivienne stood in the doorway and didn't step inside. "This is a place where no one touches you unless you want them to." Maeve looked at her. 3 seconds. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, both hands resting on her knees, her back straight, her eyes open. She didn't lie down. Vivienne didn't force her. She only said, "I'm at the end of the corridor if you need me," then closed the door gently, without locking it. Maeve sat in that exact position all night, the next night too, and the night after that. For 3 straight nights, she sat on the edge of the bed in the underground room, eyes open, back straight, both hands on her knees, refusing to lie down, because over the past 14 months, she had learned one thing, that no bed, no white sheet, and no promise could erase right away. Lying down meant not seeing the door, and not seeing the door meant not knowing who was walking in. While Maeve sat on the edge of the bed underground at Star Island, with her eyes open and her back straight, more than 1,000 miles to the north, Conrad Bellamy was sitting in his office on the 7th floor of the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C., reading a report that shouldn't have cost him any sleep, and yet made him set his coffee cup down more slowly than usual. The report came from the FBI Miami office, stamped classified, sent through the internal system at 6 o'clock in the morning. Its contents were brief. Border Patrol had received an anonymous call at 4:15 in the morning and discovered a container at Pier 7, Port Miami, holding 22 women, ranging in age from 17 to 32, all in critical health condition, and being transported to Jackson Memorial Hospital. 22. Bellamy read that number again. Then he opened the attached file, a copy of the shipping records the investigation team had found inside the cab of the tractor-trailer abandoned 4 blocks from the port. The records said 23. He pushed his chair back, opened the right-hand drawer, and took out a private laptop no one in the office knew he had. He connected to the Port Miami surveillance camera system through an access portal that only 3 people in the entire FBI had authority to use. He rewound 4 hours. Black and white footage, a high overhead angle, clear enough to identify shapes but not faces. He saw a car stop 50 feet from the container at 2:43. A man got out, tall, broad-shouldered, walking straight to the container, opened the door, stood there for nearly a minute. Then a second car arrived. The second man stepped out, in a black suit, moving like someone who wasn't in a hurry but whom no one would dare stop. Bellamy didn't recognize the face, but he recognized the way the man moved. He had seen long-distance photographs of Alejandro Voss in at least 3 different surveillance reports over the past 5 years. He had never approved an arrest warrant because Voss wasn't on his priority list, or more precisely, Voss was on the list of people Bellamy deliberately didn't touch. He kept scrolling. 2:57. A woman stepped out of the container, being led toward the first car. Thin, long hair, walking slowly but refusing to lean on anyone. Bellamy zoomed in until the image broke into pixels, and then he saw the thing that made his fingers stop on the keyboard. On the girl's left hand was a ring, the shape of a college ring. He didn't need to zoom in any further, because he had seen that ring before, in a photograph on the desk of federal judge Douglas Calloway. The photograph Calloway always turned outward toward visitors whenever someone sat across from him in his office. A photograph of his daughter on the day she graduated from Georgetown, smiling, lifting her left hand to show off the ring. Maeve Calloway. Bellamy closed the laptop. Slowly. He didn't slam the desk, didn't swear, didn't stand up. He only sat there in the large office with the curtains drawn tight over the view of Pennsylvania Avenue, both hands resting on the oak desktop, his back straight, his face expressionless, and thought. Conrad Bellamy was 52 years old. Short, cropped silver hair, a square face, a firm jaw, the features of a man anyone would look at and think trustworthy before they had time to think anything else. He had testified before Congress 7 times over the past 6 years, each time wearing a dark blue suit and a deep red tie, speaking in a low, warm voice, grave enough and gentle enough for senators to nod and reporters to write favorable pieces. His hands were clean, always clean. He had never held a gun outside a firing range, had never personally ordered anyone killed, had never left his fingerprints on anything that could be traced back to him. He only made phone calls, only suggested things, only stayed silent at the right moment and said the right words to the right person. And once a month, he drove to an apartment in Alexandria, Virginia, where a man whose real name he had never asked arranged for him to meet a young girl whose real name he had also never asked, and he stayed there for 2 hours before driving home in time to have dinner with his wife. 6 years, not once suspected. Until now, because Maeve Calloway had been inside that network for 14 months, and if she was alive, she knew his face. Bellamy opened the left drawer and took out a burner phone he replaced every 2 weeks. He pressed the only number saved in it. 3 rings. "Calloway's daughter is alive," he said, his voice as even as if he were reading a budget report. Voss took her out of the container. "Find her before her father does." He hung up, removed the SIM card, snapped it in half, put the phone into the locked drawer along with the laptop, took a sip of water from the bottle on his desk, stood, adjusted his tie in the mirror hanging behind the door. At 7:45 in the morning, Conrad Bellamy walked into the 7th-floor executive conference room of the Hoover Building, wearing the face every colleague had known for 20 years. Calm, focused, trustworthy. And no one in that meeting room realized that the man who had just sat down at the head of the table had just given the order to hunt down a 27-year-old woman whom he himself had helped imprison 14 months earlier. 48 hours after the container was opened at Port Miami, 3 phone calls were made from 3 different cities, and all 3 revolved around the same question: where was the 23rd girl? The first call came from Culiacan, in the state of Sinaloa, Mexico. Carlos Fuentes sat in the office behind a cattle ranch 40 minutes by car from the city, a place where the surrounding fence stood 3 meters high and 4 men with rifles guarded all 4 corners around the clock. Fuentes was thin, tall, with sharp cheekbones, small eyes, and a habit of tapping his index finger on the tabletop whenever he was thinking. People called him El Hueso because his body looked like bone wrapped in skin, and because he had a habit of sending finger bones to his enemies before killing them. The Port Miami container was his shipment. 23 girls, a route from Guatemala through Yucatan into Florida by sea, transportation costs of about $700,000 for the entire load, with an estimated retail value 4 times higher if distributed through prostitution networks in Miami, Atlanta, and New York. A seized shipment meant someone had cut into the route, and in Fuentes' world, the man who cut into a route was more dangerous than the man who stole money, because a route took 3 years to build, but needed only 1 discovery to die. He called his Miami contact, a man named Ochoa who ran a car wash in Hialeah. "The container at Pier 7, Fuentes said. "Who touched my shipment?" Ochoa didn't know, but he had heard from Border Patrol that 22 girls had been found, not 23. Fuentes stayed silent for a long time. Then he said, "Send 2 men to Miami, not to find the shipment, to find the one who took it." The second call came from Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, New York. Yuri Petrov sat in the VIP room of a Russian restaurant on Brighton 6th Street, where the menu was written in Russian and the servers never looked directly into the eyes of the guests at the back table. Petrov was 48 years old, with a large belly, gold rings on 3 fingers, and a low, even voice that made it impossible for the listener to know whether he was pleased or about to order someone killed. The container route from Guatemala into Florida belonged to Fuentes, but the distribution network from Florida up the East Coast belonged to Petrov. He received the girls from the port and moved them through a system of motels and apartments from Miami to Charleston to Philadelphia to New York. He laundered money through a chain of laundromats and Russian restaurants along the East Coast, and he knew that if the missing girl was someone who had seen the faces of clients inside the network, she wasn't just dangerous to Fuentes, she was dangerous to him too. Petrov picked up the phone and called a number he used only when things had gone too far to be handled any other way. Conrad Bellamy's number. "I hear you have a problem in Miami," Petrov said, his voice calm, but every word heavy as stone. "A container was opened. 1 girl is missing. If she's alive and knows how to talk, you and I both have a problem." Bellamy was silent on the other end of the line. Petrov continued, "I don't care how you handle it. I only care that she disappears within 7 days. If not, I'll handle it myself. And you won't like the way I handle it." He hung up, called the waiter for more vodka, and continued eating his lunch. The third call wasn't an outgoing call, but a conversation inside the 2nd-floor office of the Star Island mansion, where Alejandro sat behind a black wooden desk, facing the window that overlooked the alligator pond, and Tommy stood across from him, with an open laptop on the desk. Tommy had spent 48 hours tracing the container's origin through old contacts from his days in military intelligence. He knew the container belonged to Fuentes. He knew the distribution network belonged to Petrov. And he knew that 1 girl missing from a shipment worth nearly $3 million would make both sides want to find her, not to save her, but to make sure she could no longer speak. 3 directions, Tommy said, his voice low, his finger pointing at the map on the screen. Fuentes will send men from Mexico. Petrov will activate his network in Brighton Beach, and Bellamy. Tommy stopped. Bellamy will use the FBI. Alejandro said nothing. He looked out at the alligator pond. Madre was lying on the southern concrete bank, motionless under the afternoon sun like a gray log. "Hand her over to the Federal Witness Protection Program," Tommy said. "That's the safest way." Alejandro kept looking out the window. "Who runs that program?" Tommy looked at him. "DOJ, coordinated with the FBI." Silence. The kind of silence that two men who had spent 9 years together didn't need to explain. FBI coordination meant Bellamy had access to the witness list. Bellamy having access meant Bellamy would know where she was. Bellamy, knowing where she was, meant she would be dead within a week. Tommy closed the laptop. Then there's nowhere safe but here. Alejandro nodded once. Then he stood, stepped out onto the balcony, and looked down at the alligator pond where Madre still lay motionless. 3 directions were closing in. Mexico from the south, Russia from the north, the FBI from above. And in the middle, beneath 6 feet of murky water and 9 alligators, a 27-year-old girl was sitting on the edge of a bed with her eyes open, holding inside her head a list of names that anyone on that list would be willing to kill her for, just to make sure they never had to hear her read it aloud. 1 week after the 3 forces began closing the circle around Star Island, Alejandro received a call from the person he least wanted to see at that moment. Frankie Del Vecchio wanted an alliance meeting. Thursday night, Giardino Restaurant in Coconut Grove, private room on the 2nd floor, 7 o'clock. It wasn't an invitation. It was a notice. Giardino was an Italian restaurant that, from the outside, looked like any other high-end restaurant in Miami. Leather-bound menus, candles on the tables, Italian wine on oak shelves. But the private room on the 2nd floor wasn't in the reservation system. No cameras, no microphones. The door was soundproofed, and there were always 2 men standing guard at the top of the stairs. Men the waiters called floor managers, though everyone knew they carried guns under their suit jackets. It was where the Miami Mafia Alliance met whenever something had to be decided by spoken words instead of text messages. Frankie Del Vecchio arrived 15 minutes early, something rare for a 34-year-old man who was usually late to every appointment, as a way of proving he mattered more than the clock. Tonight, he wore a gray 3-piece suit, a white shirt with the top 2 buttons open, black hair slicked back with gel, and an Audemars Piguet watch with a blue face glittering on his left wrist every time he lifted his hand. And he lifted his hand often, because Frankie spoke with his whole body. He laughed loudly, clapped other men on the shoulder when he joked, leaned forward when he wanted to persuade, and called everyone in the room by name as if he were the host, even though he was the youngest man in the alliance. 4 men sat around the table that night. Frankie sat at the head near the door. Alejandro sat across from him at the far end, his back against the wall, the position he always chose in any room. 2 other underbosses sat on either side. Joe Pasella, 53 years old, who ran the sports betting network in Broward County, and Sal Ferraro, 46 years old, who managed the loan sharking system along the coast from Fort Lauderdale to West Palm Beach. Both were quieter than Frankie and older than Frankie in the business. But both had been leaning more toward Frankie in recent months, because Frankie was the only one at the table who kept talking about expansion, while Alejandro kept talking about waiting. Atlantic City, Frankie said, placing both hands on the table and leaning forward. 2 casinos are selling their licenses, one on the boardwalk, one in the Marina District. The former owners went bankrupt after COVID, and the price is only 1/3 of what it was 5 years ago. If the Alliance puts up $12 million, we can control both within 6 months. He looked around the table, smiling wide. Miami is saturated. Atlantic City is the future. Pasella nodded slowly. Ferraro swirled his wine, but his eyes were on Alejandro, waiting for a reaction. Alejandro sat still. He hadn't touched the whiskey in front of him. He listened until Frankie finished speaking, then stayed silent long enough for the whole table to feel uncomfortable. "Not now," Alejandro said. His voice wasn't louder than the sound of the candles burning on the table, but the whole room heard him clearly. "I need to keep cash on hand. No outside capital this quarter." Frankie tilted his head. "You've canceled 3 deals in a row over the past 2 weeks. You refused to meet Petrov's people when they flew down to Miami last week. And now you're saying not now?" He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Are you hiding money, or are you hiding something else?" Alejandro looked at Frankie. He didn't blink. "I'm being careful." "Careful," Frankie repeated, as if the word had a strange smell. He leaned back in his chair, both hands still on the table, his fingers tapping lightly against the wood. "Alejandro, I respect you. Everyone at this table respects you, but when careful lasts too long, people call it by another name. They call it fear." Alejandro didn't answer. He took a sip of whiskey, set the glass down, and stood. "The meeting is over," he said. Then he walked out of the room without shaking anyone's hand. Tommy was waiting by the car downstairs. Alejandro got in and said nothing the whole way back. But Frankie wasn't finished. 40 minutes after the meeting, just as Alejandro had returned to Star Island and was standing on the second-floor balcony looking down at the alligator pond in the dark, he heard the gate open, the sound of a car, the sound of leather shoes on stone. Frankie Del Vecchio crossed the front yard uninvited, walked straight to the edge of the alligator pond, stopped less than 2 meters from the water, and looked down. Madre lay motionless on the concrete bank on the opposite side, her eyes glinting under the security lights. 2 smaller alligators drifted slowly in the middle of the pond. Frankie watched them for a while, then raised his head toward the balcony where Alejandro stood. "Do you know how much I count?" Frankie called out, loud enough for his voice to carry across the yard. $15,000 a year. That's what you spend feeding these lizards. Food, veterinary bills, pond maintenance, permits. $15,000 a year for a pond that doesn't make a single dollar, while we're losing market share to the Russians and the Colombians. He laughed. A wide, confident laugh. The laugh of a 34-year-old man who believed he was saying something obvious that older men were simply too stubborn to admit. Alejandro stood on the balcony, both hands resting on the railing. He looked at Frankie, looked at the alligator pond. Then he went inside, poured 2 glasses of whiskey, carried one down to the yard, placed it on the rim of the pond beside where Frankie was standing, and returned to the balcony with the other glass without saying a word. Frankie looked at the whiskey on the edge of the pond, looked up at Alejandro, waited for an answer. No answer came. He stood there for almost another minute, then gave a soft laugh, shook his head, and walked out through the gate. In the car, sitting beside an underboss named Sal Ferraro who had been waiting for him, Frankie unbuttoned his suit jacket, leaned back against the leather seat, and said loudly enough for Ferraro to hear clearly, "El Lagarto is losing his fangs." Ferraro said nothing, but he nodded. And that nod, in a world where an underboss's nod could change the ownership of an entire alliance, was worth more than any words. On the 5th day, Maeve spoke. Not because she was ready, but because the silence in the underground room had begun to weigh more heavily than the things she was trying to keep inside. Vivian Ashford sat across from her on the white plastic chair in the counseling room at the end of the corridor, a room smaller than the bedroom, with no desk, only 2 chairs placed about 4 feet apart, and a box of tissues on the floor that Maeve hadn't touched once. 4 days earlier, Vivian had sat in that exact chair, at that exact distance, and said to Maeve, "You don't have to say anything. I'll be here every morning at 9 o'clock. If you want to come, come. If you don't, don't." For the first 3 days, Maeve came but didn't speak. She sat with both hands on her knees, stared at the wall, then stood and walked out after exactly 45 minutes. Vivian didn't push, didn't ask, didn't try to fill the silence with sentences like, "I understand what you're going through," the kind Maeve had heard too many times from people who understood nothing at all. On the 4th day, Maeve began looking at Vivian instead of the wall. On the 5th day, she opened her mouth. She didn't start at the beginning, didn't tell it in chronological order, didn't talk about the violence. She talked about the faces. There were people who came, Maeve said, her voice hoarse from having used it so little for days, and I recognized them. Vivian didn't nod, didn't take notes. She only sat still and listened. "Not their names," Maeve continued, her eyes lowered to her own hands. "I recognized the type. Men wearing wedding rings. Men in expensive suits. Men that, if you met them on the street, in a restaurant, in a supermarket, you'd think, this man probably has a daughter my age." They came. They stayed for 2 hours, or 1 hour, or 40 minutes. Then they left, and not one of them looked at me. Not because they didn't see me, because they chose not to see me. They looked past me, looked through me, as if I were an object, as if, as long as they didn't look into my eyes, what they were doing wouldn't count. She stopped, took a slow breath. Vivian still didn't say anything. "There was one man," Maeve said, her voice lower now, "who came every month, silver hair, square face, a dark red tie. He was polite. He never shouted, never hit. He folded his clothes neatly on the chair before he came over. And when he was done, he washed his hands, fixed his tie in the mirror, and walked out without looking back. Every month. 14 months. Not once did he look into my eyes." Vivian asked very softly, "Do you know who he is?" Maeve looked up. "I didn't know his name then. but I knew his face. And I saw his face on television in their living room once, when the news showed him speaking before Congress. Silence. Vivian showed no outward reaction, but her chest tightened for one beat. The worst thing, Maeve said, and her voice now wasn't trembling but terrifyingly flat, wasn't the pain. It was when someone saw you and chose not to see you. After she said that, she looked down at her hands and didn't say anything else for the rest of the counseling session. Above ground, 2 concrete floors and 6 feet of water away from the counseling room, Alejandro Voss was sitting in the security monitoring room on the 2nd floor of the mansion. It was a small room with 4 screens showing images from cameras across the property, and a flat speaker mounted on the wall, connected to the audio system in the bunker. He listened to every counseling session. Vivienne knew. She didn't object, because she understood that Alejandro didn't listen to control them. He listened because he needed to know what the people he saved were carrying inside. He needed to know so he could protect them the right way. But today, for the first time in many years, Alejandro wasn't listening as a protector. He was listening as a son. His hand was holding a cup of coffee, lifted halfway between the table and his mouth, and it stopped there. He didn't drink, didn't set it down, only stopped. Because the last sentence Maeve said, "When someone saw you and chose not to see you," was almost exactly what another woman had written to him 20 years earlier, in blue ink on white paper, the handwriting slanting to the right because she was left-handed, in the letter he still kept in the locked drawer beside his bed. "The whole world pretended not to see your mother." Alejandro set the coffee cup down on the table, slowly. Not a single drop spilled. He sat there in the monitoring room, eyes fixed on the screen but seeing nothing on it, and he didn't move for a very long time. Outside the window, Madre slid across the surface of the pond in the afternoon sunlight, and he didn't look. That night, after hearing Maeve say those words in the counseling room, Alejandro didn't sleep. He lay on the bed in the 2nd-floor bedroom of the Star Island mansion, eyes open, staring at the white ceiling, the ceiling fan turning slowly, and memory pulled him back to the small kitchen in Little Havana when he was 8 years old. The house stood on Southwest 8th Street, one of the loudest streets in Miami's Cuban neighborhood, but inside the kitchen it was quiet because his mother liked to close the windows when she cooked. Isabella Voss stood in front of the gas stove, her left hand stirring a pot of black beans, her right hand tapping lightly on the counter to the rhythm of the song she was humming softly in Spanish. She often sang when she cooked, Andalusian folk songs she had carried with her from Sevilla, slow, sad melodies that stretched at the end of every line, as if the singer didn't want the song to end, because when the song ended, the silence would come back. 8-year-old Alejandro sat at the dining table doing his homework, looked up at his mother, and saw something he had seen many times before but had not yet been old enough to understand. Her eyes were looking past the wall in front of her. Not at the wall, through it, as if she were seeing another room, in another place, in another time that no one in that kitchen was allowed to know. Her hand was still stirring the pot, her mouth was still singing, but her eyes were gone. He called, "Mama," and she blinked, turned back, smiled, and said, "What is it, sweetheart?" in a warm voice, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something was always happening inside Isabella Voss, something she never told anyone, not even her husband. Raymond Voss loved her. Alejandro never doubted that. Raymond was German-American, tall, with dark blonde hair and rough hands from doing every kind of work before settling into mid-level gambling at small casinos around Miami. He wasn't rich. He wasn't poor. He made enough to live on through poker and blackjack. And he loved Isabella with the honest love of a simple man who had met a beautiful woman and could not understand why she had chosen to stay with him. Raymond bought her flowers every Friday. Raymond fixed the leaking faucet in the kitchen without needing to be asked. Raymond held her every night before sleep and said, "I love you," with a sincerity so real that Alejandro, even as a child, could feel it. But Raymond didn't understand her. He didn't understand why she was afraid of closed doors. Didn't understand why she woke at 3 o'clock in the morning and sat in the kitchen staring out the window for 2 hours without turning on the light. Didn't understand why sometimes she gripped his hand so tightly that she left marks on his skin without even realizing she was holding on. Raymond asked. Isabella smiled. "I'm fine," she said, and Raymond believed her, because he wanted to believe her. Alejandro only understood why after he grew up. Isabella Voss was born in Sevilla, Spain, into a poor family in the Triana district, on the bank of the Guadalquivir River. At 19, she was promised a restaurant job in America by a man. She believed him because at 19, people still believe beautiful promises. She boarded a cargo ship at the port of Cadiz and did not see the sun for 17 days. When the ship docked in Miami, she wasn't taken to any restaurant. She was taken to a house in Hialeah with windows boarded shut, and she stayed there until Raymond Voss found her 2 years later, on an evening when Raymond had gone to the wrong address to play poker and saw something he couldn't walk away from without doing something. Raymond wasn't a hero. He was a gambler who paid her ransom with $7,000 he had won in a 3-day poker tournament in Coconut Grove. He married her 4 months later. He never asked her what had happened during those 2 years because he was afraid of the answer, and Isabella never told him because she was afraid that if she did, Raymond would look at her differently. So she kept it. She kept everything inside, folded it neatly the way she folded bedsheets every morning, tucked it into the most hidden corner of her mind, and lived normally on the outside for 20 years. She cooked, she sang, she raised her son. She smiled when Raymond bought flowers, but her eyes still looked through walls whenever she thought no one was watching. And trauma doesn't disappear because people hide it away. It lives in the bones, in the breath, in the way she startled when a door slammed too hard. It waits. On an April afternoon, 17-year-old Alejandro came home early because his last class had been canceled. He opened the front door, set his backpack on the floor, called, "Mama," but no one answered. The kitchen was empty. The living room was empty. He walked down the hallway. The bathroom door was closed. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Silence. The kind of silence he had never heard in that house. Because Isabella was always making sound, always singing, always cooking, always calling his name when he came home. This silence was different. It was heavy. It was full. He opened the door. He saw something no son should ever see. Raymond Voss found the letter on the kitchen table when he came home 3 hours later. After reading it, he sat down on the kitchen floor and didn't get up until the police arrived. But Alejandro had read the letter before his father. He read it while sitting on the hallway floor outside the bathroom, waiting for an ambulance he knew would save no one. The letter was written in Spanish, the handwriting slanting to the right because she was left-handed, on a white sheet of paper torn from the notebook she used for recipes. Most of it was apology. Apology to Raymond. Apology to Alejandro. Apology for not being strong enough. But the last line was not an apology. The last line said, "Never pretend you don't see, Alejandro. The whole world pretended not to see your mother." He folded the letter, along the exact crease she had made, put it in his shirt pocket. He didn't cry that day. Didn't cry at the funeral. Didn't cry when Raymond began drinking every night and died of cirrhosis 4 years later. Alejandro Voss cried for the first time 3 years after that April afternoon, when he was 20 years old, standing in the basement of a cheap motel in Opa-locka at 2 o'clock in the morning, looking at a 16-year-old girl sitting on a dirty mattress with her eyes lowered to the floor in the same way he had seen his mother look through walls for 20 years. He reached out his hand. The girl didn't take it. He didn't pull his hand back. He waited. And when the girl finally took his hand, Alejandro Voss cried right in front of her without trying to hide it, because he understood that he was seeing, and he would never pretend not to see again. On the morning of the 7th day, Maeve knocked on Vivian's door at 7 o'clock, 2 hours before the counseling session. Vivian opened the door, her hair still wet, a cup of coffee in her hand. Maeve stood in the corridor, her back straight, her eyes clear, and said in a voice that wasn't a request, but almost an order, "I want to meet the person who's keeping me here." Vivian looked at her for a moment, not in judgment, but in the way of someone who had watched many women pass through this bunker and understood that the moment a victim began demanding, instead of asking permission, was the moment she was taking back something that had been stolen from. "Here, I'll ask him," Vivian said. "No," Maeve said. "Take me up." Vivian set the coffee cup down, looked at Maeve for another 3 seconds, then nodded. They walked down the corridor, up the damp concrete stairs, through the steel door, and stepped out onto the surface. Maeve blinked, not because of the morning light, but because of the sunset glow. She had lost her sense of time underground and thought it was early morning, but the Miami sky at that moment was burning orange-red in the west, and the water in the alligator pond reflected the evening light like a sheet of dark copper. Alejandro was sitting in the iron chair beside the edge of the pond, in the same place where he sat every afternoon when nothing forced him to be somewhere else. A glass of whiskey rested on the rim of the pond beside him, untouched. His eyes were on the water, where Madre was swimming slowly close to the bank, her dark gray body sliding across the surface with barely a ripple, only her yellow eyes rising above it like two pieces of amber. He heard the footsteps, but didn't turn around. Vivian stopped at the edge of the yard, about 10 meters from the pond, and stood there. She didn't go any farther. This was Maeve's meeting, not hers. Maeve walked to within about 5 feet of Alejandro and stopped. She looked at the alligator pond, looked at Madre gliding slowly past less than 1 meter from the legs of his chair, looked at the animal's jaw, long, flat, closed, powerful enough to crush the thigh bone of a grown person in one bite. Then she looked at him. "Do you use them to kill people?" Alejandro didn't turn the chair. He only tilted his head to the side just enough to look at her with half his face. "People believe that. You don't deny it? Rumors protect cheaper than bullets." Maeve didn't react to that answer. She wasn't afraid, and she didn't look impressed. She merely registered it, the way someone who had studied law registers circumstantial evidence. Not enough to convict, but enough to understand that the person across from her wasn't the kind of man who answered a question directly. "I want to call my father," she said. "Not yet. He thinks I'm dead." "I know. For 14 months he's thought I was dead." Her voice didn't tremble, but something cracked beneath the surface, like thin ice over a lake that would break if pressed even a little harder. Alejandro was silent for a moment. Then he said, his voice lower than before, "If you call, the signal could be traced. If it's traced, the people looking for you will know you're alive. If they know you're alive, they'll know you're somewhere in Miami. And if they know you're in Miami, your father won't just think he's lost you. He'll truly lose you." Maeve looked at him. He looked back. For the first time, the two of them looked straight into each other's eyes, and neither one blinked first. "I'm not your prisoner," Maeve said. "Correct," Alejandro said. "But out there, you're everyone else's prisoner." Silence. 3 seconds. Maeve looked at him for exactly 3 more seconds, long enough for him to understand that she didn't accept the answer, but also long enough for her to understand that he wasn't wrong. Then she turned and walked back toward the stairs leading down into the bunker without saying another word. No thank you. No pleading. No looking back. Vivian followed her, and the two women vanished beneath the ground. Alejandro sat alone beside the alligator pond. Madre glided past the legs of his chair without making a sound, her dark gray body moving over the water like a shadow, then slowly sinking until only her 2 yellow eyes remained above the surface. He watched the animal. Then he looked toward the stairs where Maeve had disappeared. He lifted the whiskey glass, took a sip, and for the first time in 9 years of protecting the women who passed through that bunker, Alejandro Voss thought about something he had never thought before. Every person he had ever saved had lowered her eyes when she looked at him. Maeve Calloway was the first to look him straight in the eye and tell him she didn't belong to him, and that, in a way he wasn't ready to name, made it impossible for him to look away. 4 days after the meeting beside the alligator pond, on the night of March 15th, the thermal sensor system on the southern side of the Star Island mansion triggered at 11:47. Tommy was sitting in the second-floor monitoring room when 3 red dots appeared on the screen, moving from the southern seawall toward the outer fence. Then 3 more dots appeared. 6 men. He pressed the call button to Alejandro and said 2 words, "South side." Then he opened the wall-mounted steel cabinet, took out the M110 semi-automatic rifle he had kept from his military days, fitted the thermal scope, and moved up to the mansion roof through the internal stairway in less than 90 seconds. From the roof, he could see the entire property below. The security lights were still on as usual. The alligator pond glittered under the yellow glow. The lawn lay smooth and flat. The steel fence rose 2.5 meters around the grounds, and beyond the fence, Biscayne Bay was black as ink. Tommy looked through the thermal scope and saw that all 6 figures had already crossed the fence and were moving across the southern lawn in a formation of 2 rows of 3. Professional, equipped. Definitely not ordinary thieves. They had cut the fence with hydraulic cutters, clean and fast, without triggering the vibration alarm because they cut small sections instead of breaking through the whole thing. They knew where the cameras were because they moved through the blind spots, and they knew the layout of the mansion because they were heading straight toward the main path leading from the backyard into the house, the shortest route from the seawall to the door. But they didn't know about the trap. The main path from the southern yard to the rear door of the mansion passed through a narrow stretch of ground between the alligator pond and the western wall. That stretch looked like real concrete, the same color, the same texture, even with fake cracks made to look natural. But it wasn't concrete. It was a thin composite cover laid over a folding steel frame, strong enough to hold the weight of a cat, but not strong enough to hold the weight of a grown man carrying a gun. Beneath the cover was an extended edge of the alligator pond, more than 1.5 meters deep, where Madre and 2 other alligators usually rested at night, because the water there was warmer from the heating pipes beneath it that ran from the mansion's heating system. Alejandro had designed that trap 7 years earlier and had never needed to use it, until tonight. The 2 gunmen in front stepped onto the cover at the same time. The composite sheet snapped in the middle, folded down like a hinge, and both men dropped into the water in less than half a second. The first scream rang out immediately, sharp, high, broken. Then came the sound of water exploding upward. Then the second scream, shorter than the first. Then silence. The kind of silence that comes after something ends very quickly beneath the surface. The 4 remaining gunmen froze. Tommy looked through the scope. They stood in the middle of the lawn, their formation broken, 2 of them turning their guns toward the pond, 2 turning their guns toward the fence, no one knowing where the threat had come from, because the screaming had stopped, and the water had gone still again, as if nothing had happened. Tommy fired 3 shots in 4 seconds. The first hit the nearest gunman in the shoulder, and he went down on the grass. The second hit the second gunman in the thigh, and he dropped to his knees, then crawled toward the fence. The third hit the gun hand of the third man, sending the weapon flying as he grabbed his injured hand and fell back onto the ground. Tommy didn't shoot to kill. Alejandro never ordered a kill shot unless it was necessary, because dead men didn't talk. The last man, the 6th gunman, threw his weapon onto the grass, raised both hands, and stood motionless in the yard, like someone who had just realized he had stepped into the wrong place on Earth. 10 minutes later, the 3 wounded gunmen had been given rough bandages and chained to a steel post in the mansion's eastern garage, where Alejandro kept the cars and the pond maintenance equipment. The 6th gunman, the one who hadn't been wounded, was seated on an iron chair near the wide-open garage door. From that chair, he looked straight out at the alligator pond 10 feet away. Madre had just risen to the surface after feeding, gliding slowly along the bank, her jaws slightly open, and something still caught between the front of them had not yet washed away. The gunman looked at the alligator. Then he looked at Alejandro, who stood leaning against the garage doorframe, arms crossed over his chest, face expressionless. Alejandro didn't ask a single question. He only stood there and let Madre ask for him. The gunman began talking after 4 minutes. He spoke fast, his voice shaking, his eyes never leaving the alligator. 6 men had been sent by Fuentes from Mexico by sea, landing at Miami Beach by speedboat from a mother yacht, anchored 12 nautical miles offshore. Mission: infiltrate Star Island, find the girl, handle her on site, or take her away. But it wasn't only Fuentes. Petrov had provided the logistics, the coordinates, and the camera layout from satellite images. And those satellite images weren't from Google Maps. They came from the FBI's classified imaging system, the kind only a small number of high-ranking officials had access to. Bellamy. Alejandro listened, then nodded once and signaled for Tommy to take the gunman away. He stood alone in the garage, looking out at the alligator pond beneath the security lights, and for the first time in 9 years, he understood that the thing he was protecting wasn't being threatened only by traffickers or mafia men. It was being threatened by the United States government itself. He took out his phone, called the head of the outer security team, and ordered everything doubled. Double the cameras, double the sensors, double the night guards, double the reserve ammunition. Beneath the ground, 2 concrete floors and 6 feet of water away from the mansion yard, Maeve Calloway was sitting in the common room, reading to 2 children when she heard the gunshots. The sound was muffled through the concrete, but still clear. 3 dry cracks, evenly spaced. The sound of someone firing with control, not shooting wildly. The 2 children looked up at her, eyes wide. The young woman holding her child in the next room hugged the little one tighter. Vivienne moved quickly into the hallway. Maeve didn't scream, didn't run, didn't freeze. She set the book down, stood, took the 2 children by the hands, and led them into the innermost room of the bunker, the smallest room, with no windows and the thickest concrete walls. She sat the 2 children down in the corner, pulled a blanket over their shoulders, then turned back and stood in front of the doorway, facing the corridor, her back straight, both hands clenched at her sides. She stood there until Vivienne came back and said, "It's safe now." And even then, She still didn't step out of the doorway until she heard for herself that silence had fully returned. Above, Alejandro stood on the balcony and looked down at the alligator pond one last time before going inside. Madre lay on the concrete bank, motionless, yellow eyes open, jaws closed. The pond was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. And Alejandro knew that the 6 gunmen tonight were only the first wave. News of the failed attack on Star Island spread through Miami's underworld in less than 12 hours. 6 gunmen had been sent in, none came back, and no one knew exactly what had happened except that 2 of them had vanished completely, as if they had never existed at all. Most people heard that news and decided Star Island was not a place anyone should get close to. But Frankie Del Vecchio heard it and saw something else. He saw opportunity. In the VIP room of a rooftop bar in South Beach, 2 days after the attack, Frankie sat across from Sal Ferraro and Joe Pasella with 3 glasses of bourbon on the table and only one question. How much is Voss spending to defend Star Island? No one knew the exact number, but everyone could guess it wasn't small. Doubling security meant double the wages for the night guard team, double the surveillance equipment, double the reserve weapons, and Alejandro was paying for all of it in cash because he couldn't put any of those expenses into the books. Cash that should have been flowing into the Alliance was being diverted to protect an island that Frankie believed held nothing but alligators and paranoia. He's bleeding, Frankie said, leaning forward, his finger tapping against the tabletop. And he isn't telling us why. He cancels deals, refuses partners, pulls money from the common fund, and now he gets attacked in his own home and doesn't even bother explaining to the Alliance who's targeting him. Ferraro swirled his bourbon. Voss has always kept private matters private. Keeping private matters private is one thing, Frankie replied. Dragging the whole Alliance down because of private matters is something else. Pasella looked at Frankie. What do you want? Frankie smiled. The smile he used when he had already made up his mind and only needed other people to nod. I want to talk to Petrov. The call took place that same night from a burner phone Frankie had bought with cash at a T-Mobile store on Collins Avenue. Petrov listened. Frankie spoke. The content was brief. Frankie was willing to provide all internal information on the Miami Alliance, the partner lists, money laundering routes, shipping schedules, access codes to the shared financial system, in exchange for control of Alejandro's 2 casinos. After Alejandro was brought down, Petrov asked only one question. How many men can you pull? 2 underbosses, Frankie answered. Ferraro and Pasella, enough to cut Voss off from every source of money and every contact inside the Alliance. Petrov was silent for 5 seconds. Fine, he said. Then he hung up. 48 hours later, Alejandro Voss's empire began collapsing from the inside. On Monday morning, Alejandro's chief accountant called Tommy at 7 o'clock. His voice was shaking. 4 business accounts had been flagged by the IRS for random audits at the same time, something that, statistically speaking, was almost impossible unless someone inside the federal system had triggered it by hand. Every account was frozen for the duration of the audit, with no deadline specified. Tommy knew immediately it wasn't random. It was Bellamy. Monday afternoon, 3 partners in the seaside restaurant chain called to announce they were pulling their capital. Same day, same hour, same vague reason: portfolio restructuring. Not one of those 3 men had enough courage to decide on his own to withdraw capital from Alejandro Voss at the exact same time, unless someone had assured them that Voss was no longer frightening. Tuesday morning, the liquor supplier for the casino stopped delivering. The food supplier for the restaurants demanded payment in advance instead of the 30-day credit under the old agreement. The security company contracted for the 2 casinos sent an email saying it wouldn't renew the contract when it expired at the end of the month. Link by link, the supply chain that kept Alejandro's empire running was being dismantled, not with violence, but with fear. Someone had whispered into every link's ear that Alejandro Voss was about to fall. And in the underworld, a rumor of weakness was more dangerous than any bullet, because it made allies retreat before the enemy had even fired the first shot. Tuesday night, Alejandro sat alone in the second-floor office of the Star Island mansion, facing 3 screens that displayed the financial condition of his entire empire. The left screen, bank accounts, 4 red lines flashing steadily with the word frozen. The middle screen, partner list, 3 names newly turned gray, meaning disconnected, no response. The right screen, cash reserves, the number dropping faster than at any point in the past 9 years, because money was still flowing out for Star Island security, for the bunker, for food, for medicine, for Vivienne, for everything he couldn't stop paying for, without destroying the very thing he was trying to protect. Tommy entered the room, stood behind him, and looked at the 3 screens. Silence held for a long while. "How long can we hold?" Tommy asked. Alejandro didn't turn around. His eyes stayed on the blinking red numbers on the screen. "Long enough," he said. Tommy looked at him. "Long enough for what?" Alejandro didn't answer. He stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the alligator pond in the darkness below. Madre lay on the concrete bank, motionless, her 2 yellow eyes open, reflecting the security lights. The 9 alligators were still there. The bunker was still there. Maeve Calloway was still there. And Alejandro Voss was still standing there, looking out the window, while the empire around him burned slowly from within in a way no defense system could stop, because the one who had lit the fire wasn't outside the fence. It was someone who had once sat at the same table. Above ground, everything was burning. Below, it was quiet enough to hear the ventilation fan turning on the ceiling. Alejandro began going down into the bunker every night from the 3rd day, after his empire started to collapse. He told Tommy he was going down to check the bunker security system, to check the steel door, to check the sensors, to check the biometric lock. Tommy said nothing the first time, said nothing the second time. By the 3rd time, when Alejandro opened the stairway door down to the bunker at 10 o'clock at night and said, "Checking the sensors downstairs," Tommy only looked at him and nodded in the way of a man who understood but chose not to say it aloud, because there were things that, even between 2 men who had trusted each other for 9 years, would become more real than either of them was ready to accept once spoken. Tommy knew Alejandro wasn't going down into the bunker to check the sensors. He knew because the sensors could be checked from the 2nd floor monitoring room without going anywhere. And he knew because every time Alejandro went down into the bunker, he never entered the technical room at the end of the corridor where the security system was installed. He sat in the hallway, right outside the common room, the place where, every night, from 9 o'clock until almost 10 o'clock, Maeve Calloway sat in the gray fabric armchair and read to the children. She read in a low, slow, even voice. The kind of voice she used not because that was how she normally spoke, but because she had learned that children who lived in fear could sleep when the reader's voice didn't change its rhythm, didn't rise, didn't fall, but only flowed steadily like water. She read the books Vivienne kept on the shelf in the common room, children's books in English and Spanish, stories about rabbits and bears and forests where no one was chasing anyone. And Alejandro sat in the hallway, his back against the concrete wall, his eyes fixed straight ahead, listening to her voice through the open doorway. He didn't go into the room. He didn't let the children see him. He only sat there in the white corridor bright with fluorescent light and listened to a woman he knew almost nothing about read fairy tales to the children he had saved, and something inside his chest, something he had kept locked for 20 years, began to move, not open, only move, like a rusted door someone had just touched with one hand. On the 5th night he went down into the bunker. Maeve stepped into the hallway after the children had fallen asleep and saw him. He was sitting in his familiar place, back against the wall, legs stretched out, both hands resting on his thighs. He didn't pretend to be checking anything. He was simply sitting there. Maeve looked at him. He looked up. Neither of them said anything. She didn't ask, "What are you doing here?" Didn't ask, "What do you need?" She only walked over, sat down on the floor beside him, her back against the same wall, about 2 feet away from him, close enough to feel the warmth of the person beside her, but far enough that no one had to explain why they were sitting there. Silence. Not the heavy silence Maeve had carried with her for 14 months. Not the cold silence Alejandro used as a weapon in every interrogation and negotiation. This was another kind of silence, the kind 2 people find when they are both too tired to speak and trust each other enough not to need words. The kind of silence a person can only share with someone they aren't afraid of. They sat there for a long time. Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe 20. No one counted. Then Maeve said, her voice light, not turning her head, her eyes fixed straight ahead just like his. "The biggest alligator. Why do you call her Madre?" Alejandro didn't answer. He looked straight ahead at the concrete wall across from them, at the fluorescent light reflected on the floor, at nothing at all. But Maeve didn't need him to answer in order to understand. She saw his right hand tighten on his thigh, his fingers closing into one another. the veins rising on the back of his hand, holding for exactly 3 seconds before releasing slowly, one finger at a time, as if he had just let go of something he had been holding for too long. She understood that there was something behind the name Madre that he wasn't ready to say, and she didn't push. She only sat there beside him in silence until he stood, said goodnight, in a voice lower than any she had ever heard from him, and walked up the stairs toward the surface without looking back. Maeve sat alone in the corridor for a few more minutes. Then she stood, went back to her room, closed the door gently, and for the first time since she had stepped out of the container at Port Miami, she lay down on the bed, rested her head on the pillow, closed her eyes, and slept through the night without sitting up halfway through. Not because she was no longer afraid, but because, for the first time in 14 months, she had sat beside a man in silence, and that man hadn't taken anything from her. He had only sat there, and sometimes that was enough. In the 3rd week, Maeve began to change. Not in any large way, not the kind of change anyone could see at a glance, but the kind of change that happens inside first, then slowly shows itself on the outside through small details. She began leaving her room before Vivian came to call for her. She began finishing her rice instead of leaving half behind. She began walking down the bunker corridor without keeping one hand on the wall, and she began helping Vivian. 2 new girls from Guatemala had been brought down into the bunker 4 days earlier. Young, 18 or 19 years old, unable to speak English, their eyes constantly lowered to the floor, their bodies shrinking every time footsteps sounded in the hallway. Vivian didn't speak Spanish well enough to work with them, and remote interpreting over the phone wasn't an option when every communication line to the outside was tightly controlled for security reasons. Maeve spoke Spanish, not as fluently as a native speaker, but well enough to communicate. She had studied it for 3 years at Georgetown because the international law program required it, and 14 months of being locked up with girls from Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras had turned a classroom skill into a survival instinct. She sat beside the 2 Guatemalan girls in the common room, speaking to them in slow Spanish, not asking about the past, only asking whether they needed another blanket, whether they wanted something to eat, whether they wanted her to read to them. Vivian stood in the doorway and watched, and for the first time in 7 years of working beneath that bunker, she saw a victim begin to heal by caring for someone else instead of waiting to be cared for. That night, Alejandro went down into the bunker as usual. He sat in his familiar place in the hallway, his back against the wall. Maeve stepped out after the children had fallen asleep, sat down beside him, the same 2 feet of distance between them as on every night before. Silence, just like every night before. But tonight, Maeve didn't wait long before speaking. "Why do you do all of this?" She didn't look at him when she asked. She looked straight ahead, at the concrete wall across from them. Her voice was calm, not accusing, not curious in the way a reporter would be, only asking in the way someone asks after sitting beside another person for enough nights to feel she has earned the right. "You're a mafia boss. You own casinos. You sell liquor and launder money and do things I'm sure I wouldn't want to know in detail. But you also keep 9 alligators so no one will look down into the pond where you're hiding a tunnel that saves women and children. Those 2 things don't belong together. I want to understand why." Alejandro was silent, for a long time, long enough for Maeve to think he wouldn't answer, just like the night she had asked about Madre. But then he stood, said nothing, walked up the stairs, through the steel door, back to the surface, into the mansion, up to the 2nd floor, and into his bedroom. He opened the locked drawer beside his bed with the key he kept in his wallet, took out a letter folded into quarters on white paper that had yellowed at the edges. He held the letter in both hands, looked at it for a while, then walked back down into the bunker. Maeve was still sitting there. She hadn't moved. He sat down beside her, in the exact same place as before, and handed her the letter without saying a word. Maeve looked at the letter in his hand, looked up into his eyes, then she took it. She opened it slowly, carefully, following the old creases, and read. The handwriting slanted to the right, written in Spanish, blue ink on white paper. She read from beginning to end in silence, and when she reached the final line, her hand began to tremble. Not from fear. It trembled because she recognized what she was holding. This wasn't evidence. It wasn't a document. It was the wound of the man sitting beside her, written in the hand of the woman who had created that wound, not because she wanted to, but because she had no other way left. "Never pretend you don't see, Alejandro. The whole world pretended not to see your mother." Maeve folded the letter again. slowly, along the old creases, along every fold that 20 years had pressed into thin marks across the paper. She handed it back with both hands. Alejandro took it and placed it on his lap. She was right, Maeve said softly. The whole world chose not to see. Silence. Then Alejandro spoke, not looking at her, his eyes fixed straight ahead on the wall across from them. I saw. 3 words. Not loud, not emphasized. 3 words spoken in the voice of a man who had turned his entire life into an action meant to prove those 3 words, and now, for the first time, had said them aloud in front of another person. Maeve turned her head and looked at him, and for the first time since she had stepped out of the container, since she had sat on the edge of the bed refusing to lie down, since she had asked, "Is this another prison, or the old one?" Since she had looked at him beside the alligator pond and said, "I'm not your prisoner." For the first time, Maeve Calloway looked at Alejandro Voss not as a captor, not as a savior, not as a mafia boss or El Lagarto, or any other name the outside world used for him. She looked at him as a man carrying a wound like hers, and a wound recognizes a wound without needing any further explanation. That same night, more than 1,000 miles north of Star Island, Federal Judge Douglas Calloway sat in his home office in Chevy Chase, Maryland, before a desk covered in papers. He hadn't slept properly since the day the FBI told him his daughter was dead, and he hadn't believed that report from the moment he read it, because Douglas Calloway had sat on the judge's bench long enough to know when a report was written to conceal rather than illuminate. He had traced the container shipping records himself through the federal court system he still had access to. He had found gaps in the chain of evidence the FBI provided, and tonight, he found something that made him put his pen down and sit back in his chair for 5 minutes without moving. A container record from Port Miami, dated March 7th, 23 people, 22 found, 1 missing, no name. But in the physical description list recorded by Border Patrol, subject number 23 was listed as female, approximately 25 to 30 years old, reddish-brown hair, ring on left index finger. Douglas Calloway closed his eyes. His hands tightened on the desk. Then he opened his eyes, picked up his phone, and booked a flight to Miami for the next morning. Frankie Del Vecchio lost everything in 72 hours. It began with a call from Petrov on Wednesday morning. Frankie was sitting in the penthouse on the 42nd floor in Brickell, feet on the table, an espresso in his hand, looking out over Biscayne Bay through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the apartment he rented for $70,000 a month, and he thought everything was going according to plan. Alejandro's 2 casinos were under audit. The accounts were frozen. Partners were pulling out. The alliance was leaning toward him. In just a few more weeks, Voss wouldn't have enough money left to feed his alligators, let alone run an empire. Then Petrov called. "Thank you for the inside information," Petrov said, his voice low and even, as if he were reading a lunch menu. "Very useful. Partner lists, laundering routes, financial access codes. I used all of it," Frankie smiled. "So when do we talk about the casinos?" "There is no we," Petrov said. "I've already taken over the 2 casinos, with the information you gave me. Now you're no longer needed." The line went dead. Frankie called back. No one answered. Called again. The number had been blocked. He sat there with cold espresso in his hand and stared out at Biscayne Bay, while his mind slowly processed what his stomach had understood immediately. He had just been played. Petrov had never intended to share the casinos. Petrov had used him to get inside information on the Miami alliance, then taken over everything with that very information. Frankie wasn't a partner. Frankie was a tool, and tools were thrown away when they were no longer useful. Wednesday afternoon, Ferraro called. "Petrov contacted me directly," Ferraro said, his voice low and quick, the voice of a man choosing a side and wanting to end the call before he had to explain further. "Pasella too. We're out of the old alliance. You should worry about yourself." He hung up. Wednesday night, Frankie called Bellamy. The burner number Bellamy had given him through Petrov's intermediary 2 weeks earlier, when Frankie needed the FBI to target Alejandro's accounts. The number was no longer working. He called the second number, dead too. The third number, silence. Bellamy had cut off all contact, and Frankie didn't need anyone to explain why. Internal FBI investigators were looking into an information leak. Someone outside was applying pressure, forcing the system to look at itself, and Bellamy was gathering up every thread that could lead back to him. Frankie Del Vecchio was one of those threads, and threads got cut. Thursday morning, Ochoa called from Hialeah. Ochoa, Fuentes' Miami contact, the man Frankie had never spoken to directly, but whose name he knew because in this world everyone knew everyone's name. Fuentes is sending 2 men to Miami tonight, Ochoa said. Not to find the girl anymore, to find you. Find me? Frankie said, and for the first time, his voice lost the confidence he had worn like a suit for all 34 years of his life. Why? Because you know too much. You know the route. You know Petrov's name. You know Bellamy is involved. Fuentes doesn't like people who know too much and don't belong to him. Ochoa hung up. Frankie stood in the middle of the penthouse, looked around the $70,000 a month apartment, looked at the gray suit hanging on the rack, looked at the bottle of bourbon on the shelf, looked at the Audemars Piguet on his wrist, and realized none of it would save him tonight. He opened the safe in the closet. Inside, 1 9mm Beretta, 2 magazines, and $4,200 in cash. That was all. The rest of his cash had gone into the Atlantic City plan that no one even remembered anymore. He tucked the gun into his waistband, put the money into his jacket pocket, and left the penthouse at 3 o'clock in the morning by the stairwell because he didn't trust the elevator, didn't trust the hallway, didn't trust any enclosed space where he couldn't see who was standing on the other side before stepping in. He drove the BMW out of the garage and onto Brickell Avenue at 3:15 in the morning. The city was empty. Yellow streetlights reflected on the wet road after the night rain. He drove to the Mandarin Oriental Hotel on Brickell Quay. The front desk looked at the screen, looked at him, and said, "We're very sorry. There are no rooms available." He drove to the Four Seasons at Surf Club. "We're sorry. The system is under maintenance." He drove to W South Beach. "Your credit card has been declined." Every door closed. His name was already on a blacklist, and he didn't know who had written it, but he knew what it meant. In this world, when a man's name appeared on that list, that man no longer existed. Not dead. Worse than dead. Vanished. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Frankie Del Vecchio was driving along MacArthur Causeway toward Miami Beach, with nowhere to go. And when he looked to his left, he saw Star Island sitting in the middle of the bay, security lights glowing yellow along the seawall. Alejandro Voss's mansion standing still in the night like a fortress the world had tried to break and failed. He turned in, stopped the car in front of the gate, cut the engine, sat in the car for a long while, listening to the sea wind and, from somewhere inside the grounds, the soft slap of water. Alligators. He took out his phone and called Alejandro's number. He still remembered it because it was one of the few numbers he had memorized instead of saving in his phone. 3 rings. "I need to come in." Alejandro's voice on the other end didn't sound surprised. It didn't sound satisfied either. Just calm, as always. "Why?" Silence. A very long silence. Long enough for Frankie to hear the alligator slap the water again. Closer now, as if Madre were swimming along the seawall by the gate. Long enough for him to look down at the Beretta on the passenger seat and understand that it wouldn't save him. Long enough for him to remember the night he had stood beside the alligator pond and laughed in Alejandro's face, telling him he was spending $15,000 a year feeding a bunch of lizards. "Because there's nowhere else left," Frankie said. The gate opened. Not quickly. Slowly, evenly, both iron panels sliding apart in the night. Frankie drove in, parked on the stone path, and stepped out. Alejandro stood on the front porch of the mansion, both hands in his trouser pockets, his face expressionless. He didn't say, "I told you so." Didn't say, "You deserve this." Didn't say anything at all. Frankie crossed the yard, past the alligator pond without looking down, and stopped in front of Alejandro. He didn't look into Alejandro's eyes. He looked down at his own shoes, the $400 Italian leather shoes he had worn when he left the penthouse, now wet from the night grass, and he realized what he looked like. A 34-year-old man standing at the door of the man he had just betrayed, carrying a gun and $4,000, asking for a place to sleep through the night. Alejandro said nothing. He only turned and walked inside, leaving the door open, and that was the only invitation Frankie would receive. Frankie stayed on Star Island for 3 days. He slept in the first-floor living room. He ate whatever Tommy brought him. He didn't ask why the mansion had so many cameras. Didn't ask why Alejandro disappeared every night and came back from the direction of the alligator pond. Didn't ask why. Sometimes, he heard the faint sound of children crying from somewhere beneath the ground, but never saw a child inside the house. He didn't know about the tunnel, didn't know about the bunker, didn't know about Maeve Calloway. He knew only one thing. He had done everything exactly the way the Underworld had taught him. Faster, stronger, riskier, take before being taken, strike before being struck, and he had lost everything. But Alejandro Voss, the man he had said was losing his fangs, the man who spent $15,000 a year feeding alligators, the man who refused to expand, refused to attack, refused every single thing Frankie believed was strength, that man was still standing, in his own mansion, on his own island, with 9 alligators swimming slowly in the pond outside the window, and the gate had opened at 4 o'clock in the morning for the man who had betrayed him, without a single word. Douglas Calloway arrived in Miami on Friday morning, on the first flight out of Reagan National at 6:15, sitting in economy because a federal judge traveling on official business in business class would have left a trace in the booking system that the FBI could access. He wore a gray jacket, khaki pants, and walking shoes, looking more like a 58-year-old man on a weekend trip than a federal judge personally investigating the disappearance of the daughter whom the nation's leading agency had told him was dead. He rented a car with cash at the Hertz counter at the airport, used his real driver's license but didn't use a credit card. He drove to a small hotel in Coral Gables, checked in with cash, and waited. Tommy Shaw called him at 9 o'clock at night from a number he'd never seen before. Wynwood, warehouse number 112 on Northwest 26th Street. Midnight. Come alone. Don't bring a phone. He arrived at 11:45. Wynwood at night wasn't anything like Wynwood in the daytime. No tourists taking pictures of murals, no cafes open, only old warehouses with roll-up steel doors and yellow streetlights casting long shadows across the road. Warehouse number 112 had its door slightly open. Tommy stood inside, alone, motioned for him to enter, then pulled the door shut behind him. Inside was a wide space with a high ceiling, a concrete floor, an iron table in the center with 2 chairs facing each other, and one overhead bulb casting white light down over the table, while leaving the rest of the warehouse sunk in darkness. Alejandro Voss sat in the far chair, his face half in light and half in shadow, both hands resting on the table, no visible weapon on him. He watched Douglas Calloway walk toward the table beneath the light and saw something he'd seen in many people, but had never seen in a federal judge: exhaustion down to the bone. Calloway hadn't aged in the way of silver hair or wrinkled skin, but in the way of the eyes. His eyes were hollow, shadowed underneath, carrying the look of a man who'd spent too many nights staring into darkness and finding nothing there. 14 months of losing his daughter had carved into his face in a way 10 ordinary years couldn't have done. He sat down in the chair across from Alejandro. The 2 men looked at each other, a federal judge and a mafia boss, the law and the underworld. In any other circumstance on Earth, they would have been enemies. But tonight, inside that warehouse in Wynwood, they were 2 fathers, one searching for his child, and one keeping a promise to his mother. "I know you have my daughter," Calloway said, not as an accusation, not as a question. He said it as a fact he'd spent 14 months and hundreds of hours assembling from broken pieces. Alejandro looked at him. "She's safe." Calloway closed his eyes for 2 seconds. 2 seconds in which everything he'd held back for 14 months nearly broke across his face. Then he opened his eyes. "I want to see her." "Not yet. She's my daughter." "I know. But if you see her now, Bellamy will know she's alive." Calloway went still when he heard Bellamy's name, not because he was surprised, but because it confirmed what he already knew. He'd suspected Bellamy since the 3rd month, when the FBI report about his daughter changed details 3 times, and no one explained why. Now, hearing that name from the mouth of a mafia boss in a warehouse at midnight, the final piece fell into place. "If Bellamy knows she's alive," Alejandro continued, his voice low and even, "he'll know she's in Miami. He'll use every FBI resource to find her, and you'll lose her a second time, this time forever." Calloway clenched both hands on the iron table. The veins rose on the backs of his hands. His knuckles turned white from gripping too hard. He was a federal judge. He'd sat on the bench for 30 years and ruled on hundreds of cases where personal emotion wasn't allowed to touch judgment. But tonight, he wasn't a judge. He was a father, and a father wanted to run to wherever his child was, hold her, and never let her go. But he understood the logic. He hated it, but he understood it. "Is she all right?" Calloway asked, and his voice cracked for the first time. "She's stronger than you think," Alejandro said. And he said it not to comfort him, but because he'd seen Maeve stand guard at a doorway for 2 children when gunfire sounded above them, had seen her translate Spanish for 2 Guatemalan girls whose names she didn't yet know, had seen her sit beside him in the bunker corridor and not demand an answer when he wasn't ready to give one. She was strong. That was the truth. Calloway released his hands, laid them flat on the table, and drew in a long breath. "What do you need?" "A U.S. attorney who isn't under Bellamy." Calloway looked at him. "You want to take this to a grand jury. Maeve is the only witness. She knows names, dates, places. But if we hand this to the FBI, the case dies because Bellamy will kill it from the inside. We need an independent U.S. attorney, a sealed grand jury, no Washington Channel." Calloway thought about it. Not for long. "Patricia Vaughn," he said. "U.S. Attorney for the Middle District of Florida, Jacksonville office. Clean. I was no one. I appointed her 7 years ago." Alejandro nodded. "There's one more thing." He placed a USB drive on the table. Small, black, unlabeled. "Evidence of money laundering through my 2 casinos and restaurant chain. 9 years. Every transaction. Every account. Every route." Calloway looked at the USB, then looked at Alejandro. "This is evidence against you. Yes. You'll go to prison. Maybe. Then why?" Alejandro looked at the USB on the iron table, beneath the white light, inside the warehouse in Wynwood at midnight, and he didn't answer Calloway. But when Tommy drove him back to Star Island after the meeting, along MacArthur Causeway, with yellow streetlights sliding across the windshield, Tommy asked that exact question. "You're burying yourself," Tommy said, eyes on the road, his left hand on the steering wheel, his right hand on his thigh, his thumb tapping lightly against the fabric of his pants the way it always did when he was worried. "You handed evidence against yourself to a judge. You know what the result is." Alejandro looked out the window, toward Star Island appearing in the middle of the bay, security lights glowing yellow along the seawall, the mansion standing still, the alligator pond glimmering under the moonlight. "I'm holding the pond," he said. Tommy said nothing more. Because he understood. The pond wasn't the alligator pond. The pond was the promise. It was the tunnel. It was the 14 women and 7 children sleeping beneath it. It was the letter in the locked drawer. It was Isabella. And now, it was Maeve Calloway. And Alejandro Voss was willing to burn down his empire to keep all of it safe, because an empire could be rebuilt, but a promise to the dead couldn't. Maeve Calloway came up from beneath the ground at 7 o'clock in the morning, on April 28th, nearly 2 months after the night she was pulled out of the container at Port Miami. She climbed the concrete steps, passed through the steel door, crossed the edge of the alligator pond where Madre lay motionless on the bank in the dawn light, and stepped into the front yard of the Star Island mansion. Sunlight struck her face. She blinked, lifted a hand to shield her eyes, and stood still for almost 10 seconds. Not because it hurt, but because she had forgotten what the sun looked like when it wasn't shining through a ventilation duct. Vivian stood at the bunker door watching her. She had prepared a gray suit for Maeve, a white shirt, flat shoes, her hair tied neatly back. Not clothes meant to make her beautiful. Clothes meant for court. Maeve looked different from the woman who had stepped out of the container 2 months earlier. She was still thin, but no longer thin with hunger. Her eyes still had dark circles, but they no longer held that hollow emptiness. She stood straight. She looked straight ahead, and when she walked toward the armored vehicle parked in the front yard, her steps didn't shake. The black armored Cadillac Escalade had bullet-resistant glass and run-flat tires, prepared by Tommy the night before. Tommy sat in the driver's seat, his left arm resting on the steering wheel, the same arm that still trembled slightly when the weather changed, but was still steady enough to keep the vehicle straight at 140 kilometers an hour if needed. Alejandro sat in the back seat on the right. He wore a black suit, his face expressionless. But when Maeve opened the door and sat in the back seat on the left, he looked at her long enough for her to know he was looking. She said nothing. He said nothing. Tommy started the vehicle and drove out through the Star Island gate. The car turned left onto MacArthur Causeway, heading toward the mainland, then would get onto Interstate 95 North and drive straight to Jacksonville, about 5 hours away. Patricia Vaughn, the United States Attorney Calloway had recommended, was waiting at the federal office in Jacksonville with a sealed grand jury that had been convened 3 days earlier. Maeve would testify. She would give names, give dates, give places, and after today, no one would be able to pretend they didn't see anymore. The vehicle had been driving for about 2 minutes on MacArthur Causeway when Maeve's hand moved across the leather seat. She didn't look down. She didn't look over. Her hand only slid across the seat, slowly, as if she didn't have full control over it. until her fingers touched the back of Alejandro's hand. He didn't take hold of her right away. His hand lay still on the seat, his fingers slightly curled, and he felt her fingers against his skin but didn't move. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Then he held her hand. Not tightly. Not in a way that pulled her back. He only closed his fingers around hers, gently, just enough for her to know he was there, and just enough for him to know she allowed it. The first touch. On MacArthur Causeway, at 7:06 in the morning, with Biscayne Bay glittering on both sides and the Miami skyline behind them. At 7:08, Tommy looked into the rearview mirror and saw 2 black SUVs, Chevrolet Suburbans with dark windows, following about 300 feet behind. They hadn't been there 30 seconds before. Behind us, Tommy said, his voice flat, not panicked. 2 vehicles, Suburbans, accelerating. Alejandro let go of Maeve's hand, turned and looked through the rear glass. The 2 Suburbans were separating, one moving into the left lane, the other holding the right, forming a pincer formation to box them in from both sides. And up ahead, at the end of the bridge near the turnoff to the mainland, a 3rd Suburban was parked sideways across the road, blocking both lanes. An ambush. Tommy didn't ask. He accelerated instantly, slammed the gas pedal to the floor, and the Escalade roared forward. At that exact moment, Alejandro understood. They knew the route. They knew the departure time. They knew the direction. There was only one way they could know those things. Someone from inside had passed the information out. Not Tommy. Not Vivian. Not Frankie, because Frankie didn't know about Maeve or the Jacksonville plan. Someone from below the bunker. One of the women he had saved. One of the people he believed was a victim. A false victim. Petrov had planted someone inside the trafficking network 2 years earlier. A girl trained to behave like a victim, to be rescued by Alejandro's team, to be taken down into the bunker, and to wait. 2 years of waiting. With a tiny phone hidden inside the mattress lining that no bunker sensor had detected, because it was turned on only once a week for 40 seconds to send one single message. The first shot shattered the rear right window. Maeve ducked on instinct, both hands over her head. Alejandro pushed her down onto the floor of the vehicle and covered her with his body. Tommy swerved left, avoiding the Suburban trying to force them from the right. The second shot punched through the rear left door and lodged in the armored steel layer inside it. The third shot struck the windshield, but didn't pass through. The bullet-resistant glass cracked into a spiderweb and held. Tommy drove straight toward the Suburban, blocking the road ahead. At 50 meters, he jerked the wheel right, aiming for the gap between the Suburban and the bridge railing. A narrow opening, just wide enough for the Escalade if his calculation was right. His calculation was right, but not completely. The Escalade slipped through the gap, the right side mirror ripped away, the body scraping against the steel railing and throwing sparks for 30 meters. And as the vehicle was breaking through the trap, a shot from the Suburban on the left pierced the driver's side window and hit Tommy in the right shoulder. Blood sprayed across the cracked windshield. Tommy pitched forward, his left hand still gripping the wheel, his right hand dropping away. But he didn't stop the car. He couldn't stop the car. The Escalade broke through the roadblock and accelerated along the last stretch of MacArthur Causeway, but one of the Suburbans behind slammed into the rear of the vehicle at high speed. The Escalade lurched, its 2 right wheels lifting off the road, and in that endless moment, Alejandro held Maeve tight against the floor. Tommy gripped the steering wheel with one hand while blood soaked half his body, and the vehicle flipped, one full roll. Then it slid on its roof for 20 meters across the asphalt of the bridge. Sparks, the shriek of grinding steel. Then it stopped. 2 seconds of silence. Then Alejandro kicked the door open and pulled Maeve out through the shattered window. Blood ran from a cut on his forehead into his right eye. He wiped it away with the back of his hand and pulled Maeve to her feet. She could stand. Her legs trembled, but she could stand. Tommy crawled out from the driver's seat, his right shoulder soaked with blood, his face white, but his eyes were still open, and his left hand was still holding the Glock. "I'm fine," Tommy said, his voice grinding through his teeth. "Go." The 2 Suburbans behind them were turning around. They had about 90 seconds before they reached them. Alejandro looked around. MacArthur Causeway. The middle of the road. The vehicle overturned. Tommy wounded. Maeve standing beside him on the asphalt in a blood-stained gray suit, her green eyes looking straight at him, not asking, "Are we going to die?" but asking, "What now?" Alejandro took out his phone. The screen was cracked but still working. He scrolled through his contacts. Most of the numbers were dead. Partners had pulled out. The alliance had collapsed. The security team was back on Star Island and couldn't get there in time. There was one number left, the last number he had never thought he would call. Frankie Del Vecchio. He pressed call. 2 rings. Frankie answered. Frankie Del Vecchio reached MacArthur Causeway in 9 minutes. He didn't come alone. 8 men in 4 cars, all of them his people from before he lost everything. Gunmen who were loyal to him for personal reasons, not for money, because he didn't have any money left. They came from the Miami Beach side, blocking the 2 Suburbans that were turning around and charging toward Alejandro. The 4 cars spread across the bridge, sealing off both lanes, and 8 men stepped out with their guns aimed at the 2 Suburbans. No one fired first. In the underworld, 8 guns pointed straight at your face from 30 meters away was a question. And that question was, do you want to die here, or do you want to turn around? The 2 Suburbans stopped. 15 seconds. Then they turned, backed away, and vanished toward the mainland. Fuentes' men. Hired hands, not commanders. They'd been paid to carry out an ambush, not to die on a bridge in broad daylight in front of 8 guns. Frankie walked over to where Alejandro stood beside the overturned Escalade, dried blood on his forehead, one hand supporting Maeve, the other still holding the phone. Frankie looked at the flipped vehicle, looked at Tommy sitting against the bridge railing with his right shoulder soaked in blood and his face white as paper, but still holding the Glock in his left hand. Looked at Maeve standing beside Alejandro, her gray suit stained with blood and asphalt dust, her green eyes fixed on him without blinking. Frankie didn't ask who she was, didn't ask why she was there, didn't ask why someone had just tried to kill her on a bridge in the middle of Miami at 7 o'clock in the morning. He only looked at Alejandro and said, "Where do you need to go?" "Jacksonville." Frankie nodded. He didn't do it out of kindness. Frankie Del Vecchio wasn't a good man, and had never pretended to be one. He did it because of a debt. Because 2 weeks earlier, when he had stood outside the Star Island gate at 4 o'clock in the morning with a Beretta and $4,200, he had said, "There's nowhere else left." And Alejandro had opened the gate without saying a word. In Frankie's world, that debt weighed more than money, more than blood, more than everything he'd lost, because no one had opened a gate for him except the man he'd betrayed. 2 of Frankie's men took Tommy to Mount Sinai Hospital on Miami Beach through diplomatic channels, which meant Tommy was brought into the emergency room with false paperwork, and no one asked why there was a bullet hole in his shoulder. Frankie drove Alejandro and Maeve onto Interstate 95 North toward Jacksonville. 5 hours on the highway. Alejandro sat in the back with Maeve. He didn't hold her hand again. They both sat still, 20 centimeters apart, looking out opposite windows, and didn't say a single word for 5 hours. But those 20 centimeters were smaller than any distance between them in the past 2 months. Because on MacArthur Causeway, when the car flipped and there was blood and broken glass and gunfire, Maeve had taken his hand and he had held hers, and that didn't need to happen again for both of them to know it had happened. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Maeve Calloway walked into the federal office in Jacksonville. Patricia Vaughn, the United States Attorney, met her in the 3rd-floor corridor with 2 court security officers and a stenographer. The grand jury had been waiting in a sealed room since 10 o'clock that morning. 16 ordinary citizens summoned in secret. Not through the Washington system, not through the FBI. Maeve sat in the witness chair. She told them, without shaking, without hesitating, she gave the names of every client whose face she remembered, gave dates, gave places, gave schedules. She told them about the silver-haired man in the dark red tie who came every month and folded his clothes neatly on the chair before he approached her. She said his name, Conrad Bellamy, Deputy Director of the FBI. The sealed room went silent. 16 ordinary citizens looked at one another. Vaughn kept taking notes without looking up, and Maeve kept talking. For 2 hours and 45 minutes, she sat in the witness chair. When she walked out, the indictment had already been approved by the grand jury. On the same day, at the same hour that Maeve was naming Bellamy in Jacksonville, Alejandro Voss was sitting in the basement parking garage of the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Brickell. He had gone there alone, unarmed. No Tommy, because Tommy was in the hospital. He sat on the hood of a rental car, waiting, because he knew Bellamy would come. He knew because he had asked Calloway to send Bellamy a message through an official court channel. "I know what you did. Meet me at Mandarin Oriental, basement level B2, this afternoon, or the indictment will include camera photographs from the apartment in Alexandria." Bellamy arrived at 4 o'clock. He parked on basement level B2, stepped out, and saw Alejandro sitting on the hood of a rented Honda Civic 20 feet away, under the blue-white neon lights of the garage, calm-faced, both hands resting on his thighs, the cut on his forehead covered with a small piece of gauze. Bellamy had a gun, a standard FBI Sig Sauer P229, drawn from the holster beneath his suit jacket before he stepped out of the car. He aimed the barrel at Alejandro from 10 feet away. "You think you're a hero?" Bellamy said, his voice still low, still warm, still the voice Congress trusted and reporters admired. But beneath that voice, something was cracking. "You're a criminal. Just like me. You launder money. You bribe people. You run an illegal empire. You and I aren't different." Alejandro looked straight at the barrel of the gun. Then he looked up into Bellamy's eyes. "I'm a criminal who keeps alligators," he said, his voice flat, no louder than the buzzing neon lights above them. "You're the deputy director of the FBI who buys women. We aren't the same." Bellamy tightened his grip on the gun. His jaw flexed, his eyes flickered, and in that moment, Alejandro saw what he'd seen in many men who were about to do something they couldn't take back. Desperation. Bellamy pulled the trigger. The firing pin struck an empty chamber, dry, sharp, no bullet. Bellamy looked at the gun in his hand, pulled the trigger again. Empty. Again. Empty. Tommy Shaw, before being taken to the hospital on MacArthur Causeway that morning, had said one sentence to Alejandro. "Bellamy parks at the Mandarin Oriental every Tuesday afternoon when he comes to Miami. Basement level B2. He keeps his gun in the trunk compartment." Tommy had sent a man to the parking garage at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, opened Bellamy's trunk with a signal spoofing device, removed the firing pin from the Sig Sauer, placed the weapon back exactly where it had been, and closed the trunk again. 12 minutes. No trace left behind. Bellamy stared at the useless gun in his hand, looked at Alejandro still sitting on the hood, unmoving, his gray-blue eyes fixed on him without blinking. Then the basement door behind Bellamy opened. 4 men stepped in, wearing dark navy jackets with United States Marshals printed in white across the back. One of them said, "Conrad Bellamy, you're under arrest under federal indictment number 47-24-157, issued by the grand jury for the Middle District of Florida." Bellamy didn't run, didn't shout, didn't explain. He only stood there, the Sig Sauer slipping from his hand and clattering onto the concrete floor, and let the United States Marshals cuff him beneath the blue-white neon lights of the Mandarin Oriental parking garage, where, 2 hours earlier, he had still believed he was untouchable. That same night, the FBI, working with New York police, executed an arrest warrant in Brighton Beach. Yuri Petrov was handcuffed in the VIP room of the Russian restaurant on Brighton 6th Street, in the middle of dinner, in front of 4 old friends, not one of whom looked at him as he was led away. The following week, Carlos Fuentes wasn't arrested. He was dealt with by Sinaloa itself, not for human trafficking, but for stupidity. The cartel had one unwritten rule: do whatever you want, but don't let the cartel's name appear on CNN. Fuentes had broken that rule when the ambush on MacArthur Causeway happened in broad daylight, in front of traffic cameras, in front of witnesses, in front of everything the cartel hated most in the world, media lights. They found Fuentes' finger bones in a wooden box sent to Ochoa's office in Hialeah 3 weeks later. No one sent the rest. In the weeks after Bellamy was arrested, the federal justice system did exactly what it was designed to do. It turned back and looked at everything. And when it looked at Alejandro Voss, it found plenty to look at. The 2 casinos were seized under a federal court order. The 72-foot yacht at Island Gardens was frozen. The bank accounts that had already been frozen from the IRS audit Bellamy had arranged remained frozen. And now they were frozen officially by a real court order instead of a false one. The seaside restaurant chain was sold off in liquidation to provide compensation. 60% of the empire Alejandro Voss had spent 20 years building disappeared in less than 90 days. But the Star Island mansion still stood, not because the FBI didn't want to take it, but because it didn't belong to Alejandro. It belonged to the Ruth Foundation, a legal charity Alejandro had created 9 years earlier, independently registered, with its own board of directors, its own accountants, and its own lawyers. It wasn't a last-minute trick. It was something he had prepared from the very first day, because he had always known that one day the system would look at him, and when that day came, he needed the mansion to remain standing, because the mansion wasn't a house. The mansion was the lid over the pond, and the pond was the lid over the tunnel, and the tunnel led to the place where, for the past 9 years, 47 women and 23 children had been hidden from the world that wanted to swallow them whole. The secret bunker was exposed during the investigation. The FBI found it while scanning the Star Island property with ground-penetrating equipment. They opened the steel door, went down the concrete steps, and found the white corridor, the small bedrooms, the medical station, the counseling room, and traces of life. Children's books on the shelves, children's pajamas hanging on hooks, antiseptic in a drawer, and a small photograph taped to the wall of the common room, showing 7 children sitting on the rug and smiling at the camera, taken by Vivian Ashford on a Sunday afternoon no one knew about except the people who had lived underground. News of the tunnel spread within 48 hours. The media called it many different things. The mafia boss's secret bunker, the bunker under the alligator pond, El Lagarto's underground network. But when Alejandro Voss's trial took place in Miami federal court 3 months later, what the judge and jury heard wasn't the story of a mafia boss. It was the story of 47 women and 23 children who came forward to testify. They came from Guatemala, Mexico, Honduras, Colombia, Spain, Romania, Russia. They spoke about dark rooms, containers, motel basements, and they spoke about the tunnel beneath the alligator pond, where they had slept safely for the first time in months or years. The young woman holding the child in pale yellow pajamas, the one Maeve had seen on her first night down in the bunker, also testified. She spoke in Spanish through an interpreter. He never asked my name. He only opened the door and said, "You're safe here. My daughter was born in that bunker." It was the first place she ever knew. The court sentenced him to 3 years in prison for money laundering. Not life, not 20 years, 3 years. Because 47 women and 23 children had told the jury that the man sitting in the defendant's chair, criminal or not, had done what the whole system had failed to do. He had seen them when the rest of the world pretended not to see. On the afternoon before Alejandro went to prison, he stood beside the alligator pond at Star Island for the last time. Sunset. The Miami sky burned orange-red in the west. Madre swam slowly through the center of the pond, her dark gray body sliding across the water that reflected the evening light, her 2 yellow eyes rising like pieces of amber. Maeve stood beside him. She wasn't wearing the gray suit anymore. She wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, her reddish-brown hair falling to her shoulders, and she looked so different that if someone had placed a photograph of her now, beside a photograph of the woman who had stepped out of the container 11 weeks earlier, they wouldn't have believed it was the same person. "I'll be here when you get out," she said. Alejandro looked at the alligator pond. "You don't have to." "I know," Maeve said, "but I want to." Silence. Madre slid past the legs of the iron chair where Alejandro used to sit every evening, swam slowly along the concrete bank, and sank little by little until only those yellow eyes remained above the water. "Take care of Madre for me," Alejandro said. Maeve looked at him. "Which one?" And Alejandro Voss smiled. For the first time in this entire story, he smiled. Not a loud smile, not a joyful laugh, just a small smile, tugging lightly at the right corner of his mouth, making the scar along his left jaw crease a little, and filling his gray-blue eyes with something they had never held in all 37 years of his life. 3 years later, on an October morning, a black car stopped in front of the gates of Coleman Federal Prison in Central Florida. Tommy Shaw stepped out of the driver's seat, his right arm permanently weakened after the bullet on MacArthur Causeway, but his left hand still steady, and his eyes still sharp. He leaned against the car and waited. The prison gate opened. Alejandro Voss walked out, thinner, hair shorter, but his back was still straight, and his gray-blue eyes still looked ahead in a way that 3 years behind bars hadn't changed. Tommy didn't hug him, didn't shake his hand. He only nodded and opened the car door. "Home," Tommy said. He drove down Interstate 75, then cut over to Interstate 95 south, toward Miami. 4 hours on the road. Alejandro sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window, watching Florida slide past. The sugarcane fields, the Everglades marshes, the billboards along the highway, and he didn't say anything for 4 hours because he was learning how to look at the world again without concrete walls around him. The car turned into Star Island at nearly 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The gate opened. The white stone path was still there. The alligator pond was still there. But something was different. Along both sides of the pond, where there had once been only gray concrete and short grass, there were flowers now. Florida wildflowers, yellow daisies, red salvia, purple lantana, planted along the concrete edge, growing around the legs of the iron chair where he used to sit at every sunset, spreading down the path from the gate to the edge of the pond, turning the grounds that had once looked like a fortress into something he didn't have a word for at first, but would later call home. Maeve had planted flowers for 3 years, one kind each season, one new bed each month. She planted them around the alligator pond where Madre still swam every afternoon. And Madre never touched a single flower, as if the old alligator understood that what was growing around her pond belonged to someone she was waiting for too. Maeve stood on the front porch of the mansion. She wore a white blazer, her hair tied neatly back, thin framed glasses on her face, the kind she had begun to need after reading too many legal documents over the past 3 years. She had passed the Florida bar exam. She was working for an anti-trafficking organization with an office in Coral Gables, an organization Vivian Ashford had introduced her to, and Douglas Calloway supported legally from Washington. Standing beside her was Douglas Calloway, his hair whiter than it had been 3 years earlier, his back a little more bent, but his eyes were no longer hollow because he had found his daughter again, not during the 14 months of searching, but in the moment she called him from Jacksonville after the grand jury hearing and said, "I'm all right, Dad." And he sat down on the floor of his office in Chevy Chase and cried for 15 straight minutes. Alejandro stepped out of the car, walked along the stone path, past the flower beds she had planted, and stopped in front of the porch. He looked at Maeve. Maeve looked at him. "Welcome home," she said. 2 words. He didn't hug her in front of her father. He only stood there, and Maeve stepped forward, touched his hand, just as she had in the car at 7:06 on MacArthur Causeway. And he held on, just as he had then, and the two of them stood there in front of the Star Island mansion, with Madre swimming slowly in the pond behind them, and wildflowers growing along the concrete bank, and Douglas Calloway standing beside them, wiping his eyes without hiding it. Frankie Del Vecchio wasn't there that day. But every month, a sum of money was transferred into the Ruth Foundation account from a small casino management company in Miami Beach that Frankie ran with the last capital he had left. No one forced him to do it. There was no contract, no agreement. When a local reporter asked him why, Frankie said, "Because I once laughed at a man who kept alligators, and that man opened the gate for me at 3 o'clock in the morning when there was no one else left in the world who would open a gate for me." Sometimes, the strongest stories aren't about the strongest person. They're about the most patient one, the one who chooses to protect what the whole world calls useless, dangerous, wasteful, until the day everyone needs it arrives. And it is still there. Alejandro Voss kept 9 alligators not to kill anyone. He kept them so no one would look down into the water. Because beneath the water, he was keeping a promise to the woman the whole world had pretended not to see. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson this story leaves behind. That the true value of a person doesn't lie in what they build outside for the world to look at, but in what they hide beneath and protect with their whole life when no one is watching. That sometimes the person called a monster is the only one willing to open his eyes and look. And that goodness doesn't always look like goodness. Sometimes it looks like an alligator pond, a criminal empire, a man with a scar along his jaw sitting alone in the dark. But underneath all of it, it is still goodness. Some things only look dangerous until you understand what they're protecting. And some men only look like monsters until you see what they're hiding underneath. If this story touched you, if it made you pause for a second and think about someone in real life, someone misunderstood, someone quietly protecting something no one else knows about, then please like this video right now. Share it with someone you think needs to hear this story. Maybe a friend, a loved one, or anyone who needs to be reminded that there are still people in this world who choose to see when everyone else pretends not to. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories, because we bring you stories like this every day. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of anyone in real life? Maybe a father who quietly sacrificed without ever telling anyone, a mother stronger than anyone knew, or a friend you once judged before you understood who they truly were. Share your story in the comments below. We read every single comment and always want to hear the feelings that come from deep in your hearts. Thank you sincerely for being here and listening until the very last minute. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.